The cause of death for Miss Betsy Hackman, aged 65 years, is Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. The manner of death is natural. Autopsy examination and full-body postmortem CT demonstrated no findings of trauma internally or externally. With microscopic findings consistent with Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. Laboratory testing was positive for Hantavirus at a clinical lab, with required confirmation testing positive at Scientific Laboratories Division. Testing for COVID-19, influenza, and other common respiratory viruses was negative. Testing for carbon monoxide was negative. The cause of death for Mr. Gene Hackman, aged 95 years, is hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's disease as a significant contributory factor.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Gene Hackman likely stumbled about his home like a zombie, disoriented, dazed and confused for several days on end. Was he able to feed himself if he couldn't even tell his wife was deceased? Clearly he wasn't able to feed poor Zinner, the 12-year-old Australian Kelpie who'd recently had an operation. What none of us anticipated was that Betsy, relatively young, 30 years younger compared to Hackman, actually suffered a fatal viral infection and thus left Hackman, who was completely dependent on her, in a precarious and vulnerable state. She died first. Also, Zinner was unusually vulnerable as well, following an operation on February 9th, just 2 days before Betsy's medical emergency. Although the rare Hantavirus diagnosis provides some clarity, I mean, it's so rare. Only 1 or 2 Americans die from this virus each year. Think about that. It also raises 8 key questions, and we'll also examine Betsy's final movements on February 11th. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the hundreds of you who have recently subscribed. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So let's first deal with Betsy's final moments. According to the New York Times, on February 11th, possibly hours before her death, Betsy Arakawa sent an email to a massage therapist before visiting a grocery store in the afternoon. She was also captured on CCTV visiting a pharmacy, and she was apparently wearing a face mask while doing this, and this was something that she apparently did quite often because she was conscientiously trying not to transport any illnesses to her vulnerable older husband. That's Hackman. Friends and neighbors also said that the couple had receded into their hillside home, that increasingly became more private since the COVID pandemic. And that brings us to 8 key questions, starting with number 1, what time did Betsy die? After running errands, including to a pharmacy, Betsy returned to her neighborhood at around 5:15 p.m. And so that is the last sort of proof of life, 5:15 p.m. It's possible that Betsy may have died shortly after arriving home, perhaps 6 p.m., perhaps 7 p.m., but possibly that evening. And it's possible that Betsy had the dog in the crate at that time, and that Betsy wanted the dog in the crate to keep the dog quiet so that it could recover from its surgery. Now, the question is, did the bottle of pills that Betsy had with her come from the pharmacy she just visited, when she was wearing a mask? And I think it's possible and even likely. Number 2, did Betsy die instantly? Now, if Betsy was in distress, why didn't she call 911? And this part is really quite mysterious. According to The Independent, Dr. Heather Gerald, New Mexico's chief medical examiner, announced that Arakawa died from the Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. This is a severe respiratory illness caused by viruses that are transmitted to humans through contact with infected rodents. And so this suggests that there were a lot of these rodents somewhere in this big house, in this complex. And perhaps if they had had more visitors to that complex, more caretakers, this infestation could have been cleaned up or taken care of. Now, although this is the official cause of death, it's doubtful the virus struck suddenly, although it's possible that Betsy sort of left it until too late. What I mean is, I think the virus was present in her and was sort of breaking her down gradually, and then it later on manifested in a serious way. We'll deal with that in a second. Now, think about it. If Betsy was in the habit of putting Hackman first, and I think she perhaps spent a lifetime doing that, she may have underestimated her own health. She may even have ignored her own condition. And of course, she also had Zinner to worry about, and she was apparently very devoted to that animal. That brings us to number 3. What is Hantavirus? Now, according to the Daily Mail, the medical investigators in New Mexico said that there was a deadly buildup of fluid in her lungs, known medically as Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. According to The Independent, Gene Hackman died of hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. I think that is not completely accurate. I think the stress that he was going through, probably not having Betsy around, this strange situation that he found himself in, the smell, but also was he able to feed himself? And possibly if he wasn't, surely his stress levels were increasing, and then that triggered perhaps a heart attack. So I think one's got to think about that. And that's really, one can feel really compassionate towards Hackman, in this situation, that he just wasn't aware of, what was going on with him. And this also raised the question, where did Betsy come into contact with rodent droppings? Well, some have suggested it was through the cleaning of their garage. Why was Betsy, a 65-year-old, cleaning their garage when they had the resources to hire someone else to do it? I'm still not sure HPS is the problem here. I mean, it is the official finding. The thing is just, it is so incredibly rare, statistically, as to be an almost exotic disease. It's so rare in the US that only 1 or 2 people die every year. And there have only been 1,000 cases in the past 3 decades, mostly among farmers, hikers, and campers. So it seems like Betsy was really unlucky, Hackman as well. On the other hand, HPS after a period of germination can progress rapidly, and that is likely what we saw here. Someone on X posted, "What I can't quite fathom is how for 2 weeks straight, no family member thought to check on 2 sick and aging people." That is something that is quite strange. Number 4, was there no other caregiver or cleaner besides Betsy? Well, according to the New York Times, quoting Sheriff Mendoza, there's no indication that there was a caretaker at the home. And this does seem to be a weakness that contributed to the horror that befell them. And I think this is underestimated. I think this was quite a horrible situation that was playing out, not just for Betsy, but for Hackman, who just didn't know it was happening to him, and of course also for poor Zinner. And I think what was a weakness was that it was also made it difficult for others to look after Hackman, given the couple's long-standing philosophy on privacy and their devotion to each other, and also how it was Betsy's role to look after Hackman. And I think that was something that needed to be updated, that whole policy. You maybe have a plan B, have someone that could just come in and check in on them. According to the New York Times, she was very protective of him, and Hackman also seemed happy to let her run things. And Hackman had actually said, he would have been dead long ago without Betsy taking care of him. Quite an ironic statement. She was also ensuring that he ate healthily. Number 5, why did the other 2 dogs survive? Well, one of the final errands Betsy made on February 11th was to a pet store, likely buying food for the dogs. According to the New York Times, she stopped at a local pet food store later the same afternoon, that's February 11th, before returning to her home. And so, yeah, why did Bear and Nikita survive the other two dogs? It's likely due to two facts. One is that Bear Nikita had access to one additional bowl of food that Zinna didn't have. And then Zinna was also in a weakened condition due to her surgery. If you think about it, had Betsy not picked Zinna up from the surgery when she had, if she just felt, well, I'm just too ill to do it today, maybe I'll do it tomorrow or the next day, well, then Zinna would likely still be alive. And if the vet had followed up, where are you when you're going to pick up your dog, the authorities might have been alerted earlier and Hackman may have been helped earlier. And then there are other questions. Why Santa Fe? That's number 6. Well, according to the New York Times, people go to Santa Fe for solitude. And Hackman, I think, was interested in the cultural aspect, the stunning landscape, and it was a landscape that inspired artists, and Hackman was an artist and even a writer. In fact, Betsy edited some of his fictional work. Number 7, art and life. Hackman also had a cultural connection to Santa Fe, and I think this is part of why they wanted privacy, is that they want to just enjoy being by themselves, but also within an almost artistic bohemian setting. Hackman joined the board of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I think that's where she's really from, famous artist. And they invested in a restaurant, Ginger, which displayed Hackman's paintings and even named a house Mai Tai cocktail in his honor. Now, it's quite interesting just going back in time, dealing with number 8, an unlikely encounter. How did Hackman and Arakawa, who was a classical pianist born in Hawaii, how did they meet? Well, she met Hackman in LA when she was working at a fitness center, and she had a part-time job, and he'd actually forgotten his entry card, and she refused to let him in, and I guess was quite obstinate despite his reputation. But this made an impression on Hackman, and this clearly set the scene, in a sense, for a lifetime of looking after the famous actor. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say, our hearts really go out to these people and their families. It's really a horrible situation that played out, in some ways very unnecessary, but if anything, it might be a warning to other elderly people and their families to perhaps update their protocols in following up on their situations. Now, a longtime friend, according to the New York Times, said that Hackman loved Santa Fe because it allowed him to live a life that was not always that of a star. He said, I know that Gene did not like the role of a celebrity. Now, in a sense, an actor that played the everyman died the death not of a world-famous celebrity, but one even worse than an average person. And this seems to add insult to the injury. It's not the kind of ending Hackman or anyone deserved, is it? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.